Hollywood didn't collapse in silence. It collapsed in costume. How does a single movie, dripping in gold, packed with stars, built like a monument, destroy an entire studio? Behind the velvet curtains were emergency loans, backlot sales, and executives who knew the numbers weren't survivable. Tonight, we're exposing the golden age films so financially catastrophic they pushed studios toward bankruptcy, and the one disaster that changed Hollywood forever. Before the collapse, there were the columns. Outside Madrid, one of the largest exterior sets in motion picture history rose from the Spanish countryside. Full-scale replicas of ancient Roman forms stretched across acres, massive statues, marble staircases. As military formations rehearsed beneath artificial arches. This was not decorative filmmaking. It was industrial ambition. Producer Samuel Bronston had already built a European production empire through historical epics. His strategy was vertical expansion. Construct permanent studio facilities in Spain, secure international financing, and produce large-scale spectacles that could compete directly with Hollywood's biggest studios. The infrastructure depended on continuous success. One underperforming film would not simply disappoint investors, it would destabilize the system. The budget for The Fall of the Roman Empire climbed past $16 million, a staggering figure for an independent producer in 1964. Financing came through complex European loan structures and international pre-sales. The debt model assumed strong American box office performance would anchor global returns. The assumption failed. By the mid-1960s, audiences were cooling on grand historical epics. Cultural tastes were shifting. Youth-driven films were beginning to dominate attention. The film opened with respectable but not explosive numbers. Critical reception acknowledged visual scale but questioned emotional engagement. Repeat attendance was limited. The revenue curve did not match the debt schedule. Creditors demanded payment. Cash flow tightened rapidly. Ongoing productions, already financed against anticipated profits, became liabilities rather than assets. Legal actions followed. Equipment was repossessed. The once celebrated Spanish studio complex, marketed as Europe's Hollywood alternative, was dismantled under financial pressure. In 1964, the Samuel Bronston Productions declared bankruptcy. The fall was not theatrical, it was administrative. Contracts voided, assets liquidated, ambition audited. This was not merely a film that underperformed. It was an independent production empire that relied on uninterrupted spectacle, and when spectacle no longer guaranteed profit, the structure collapsed under its own scale. Rome fell twice.
This one looks like a success, and that's precisely why it matters. By 1953, Hollywood was under siege from television. Weekly attendance had dropped sharply from post-war highs. Families were staying home. Theatrical exhibition needed reinvention, something television physically could not replicate. Fox's answer was CinemaScope. The Robe became the studio's first widescreen production, designed not just as a film but as proof of concept. When the visual field expanded dramatically, biblical spectacle filled a curved horizon. The message to exhibitors was clear. Convert your theaters or risk irrelevance, but technological revolution is expensive. Fox did not simply finance a film, it financed an industry shift. The studio invested in new camera systems, specialized lenses, widescreen composition training, and an aggressive marketing campaigns promoting CinemaScope as the modern miracle you see without glasses. Trade advertising targeted theater owners directly. Conversion costs for exhibitors were substantial, and Fox provided incentives to accelerate adoption. The production budget itself was manageable by epic standards. The infrastructure investment was not. At the time, Fox's financial condition was not invulnerable. The 1948 antitrust ruling had already stripped studios of theater ownership. Under revenue pipelines were thinner, margins were more volatile. A technological miscalculation could have compounded structural weakness quickly. Fortunately for Fox, The Robe performed strongly at the box office. Audiences were curious. The widescreen format delivered novelty. The film's success encouraged wider CinemaScope conversion across major markets. But the risk had been real. Had the public rejected the format? Had exhibitors resisted conversion? Fox would have been left with sunk technological costs and limited distribution compatibility. The capital exposure relative to studio liquidity was significant. CinemaScope ultimately strengthened Fox's competitive position. Yet the robe stands as a reminder that during the Golden Age, survival increasingly depended on innovation, and innovation demanded upfront risk at a scale approaching financial vulnerability. And the film succeeded. The gamble, however, was far larger than the opening weekend suggested. The gamble was global. Producer Michael Todd did not think small. He thought in continents. Around the World in 80 Days was engineered as a spectacle of scale, filmed across multiple international locations, populated with cameo appearances from major stars, and structured as a cinematic travelogue built for widescreen exhibition. It was less a traditional production and more a logistical campaign. The budget exceeded $6 million, a significant risk in 1956, especially for an independent company without the safety net of vertically integrated theater ownership. Todd financed aggressively, relying on complex distribution agreements and leveraged arrangements that required strong global performance to maintain stability. The strategy worked. For this film, the release became a roadshow event. Reserved seating, extended engagements, and premium ticket pricing elevated its status. The film ultimately won the Academy Award for Best Picture and performed strongly at the box office. But profitability did not eliminate structural exposure. The financing model left little margin for failure. Todd's company operated without the diversified production slate of major studios. There was no cushion of smaller, reliable releases to balance risk. Each large-scale project carried disproportionate weight. Had audience reception faltered, the debt obligations could have become destabilizing. Interest payments and distribution splits meant that even success required careful accounting discipline. Around the World in 80 Days demonstrated something critical about the Golden Age marketplace. Spectacle could generate reward, but independent producers navigated narrow financial corridors. One miscalculation, one underperforming epic, could threaten operational continuity. This film succeeded, but it revealed how thin the line was between prestige triumph and financial vulnerability. In the Golden Age, ambition could elevate. It could also expose.
By the early 1960s, MGM was no longer the invincible factory of stars it had once been. Television had fractured audiences. The 1948 Paramount decree had already forced studios to divest their theater chains. Revenue pipelines were thinner, margins were tighter. MGM needed a spectacle, something enormous enough to reassert dominance. Instead, it inherited a production spiral. Mutiny on the Bounty began with prestige ambitions, exotic locations, lavish ship replicas, and Marlon Brando in a leading role. But filming in Tahiti became unpredictable and costly. Weather delays extended schedules. Creative disputes slowed progress. Brando's performance choices required reshoots and rewrites. The budget ballooned toward $19 million. When the film premiered, reviews were mixed. Audiences admired the scale, but did not return in numbers strong enough to justify the investment. The worldwide gross was substantial, yet insufficient against costs, distribution splits, and interest on production financing. For MGM, this was not an isolated misfire. It compounded an already fragile financial position. The studio began liquidating assets at a historic pace. Backlots were sold, memorabilia auctions followed, sound stages went dark, executives initiated aggressive cost-cutting measures. The once luxurious MGM infrastructure shrank dramatically throughout the 1960s. Mutiny on the Bounty did not single-handedly bankrupt MGM, but it accelerated a visible dismantling of one of Hollywood's most powerful empires. A film about rebellion became a symbol of internal instability and the beginning of MGM's long retreat from dominance. After surviving Cleopatra, Fox should have been cautious. Instead, it gambled again. Dr. Dolittle was designed as a family-friendly road to recovery, musical numbers, elaborate sets, and a talking animal spectacle intended to rival Disney. But production became complicated quickly. Animal handling delays extended filming, location shoots ran long, sets were rebuilt, songs were rewritten. The budget climbed past $17 million. Fox promoted it aggressively, positioning the film as an event. The expectation was clear. This would restore confidence after earlier financial instability. Audiences responded with polite curiosity, not sustained enthusiasm. Reviews were uneven. Word of mouth softened attendance. The domestic gross did not match the scale of spending, and international returns lagged behind projections. Fox absorbed millions in losses. The second epic miscalculation tightened financial controls within the company. Executive oversight intensified. Risk tolerance declined sharply. The era of unchecked prestige musicals at Fox effectively ended. While Cleopatra had nearly pushed the studio to collapse, Dr. Dolittle confirmed that the old production model was no longer reliable. Big budgets no longer guaranteed salvation. Fox survived again. But only by learning that spectacle without shifting audience taste could become financially dangerous. By 1969, the cultural atmosphere surrounding American cinema had shifted decisively. The audience that once sustained lavish studio musicals was aging. Younger moviegoers were gravitating toward realism, experimentation, and stories reflecting social unrest. Films associated with the emerging New Hollywood movement were drawing attention through contemporary themes and tonal unpredictability. Against that backdrop, 20th Century Fox made a calculated decision to invest heavily in traditional Broadway spectacle. Hello, Dolly was conceived as a prestige adaptation of a proven stage success. Casting Barbara Streisand ensured star visibility. Production design emphasized grandeur. Entire turn-of-the-century city blocks were constructed. Costuming budgets soared. Elaborate dance sequences required extended rehearsal and shooting schedules. The scale was deliberate. Fox believed audiences still valued polished theatrical escapism. The budget climbed to approximately $25 million. At that level, performance expectations were clear. The film would need sustained, repeat attendance across domestic and international markets. It would need to dominate for weeks, not days. Upon release, the opening numbers were respectable. Promotional campaigns were extensive. Award positioning added visibility, but the trajectory flattened quickly. Younger viewers showed limited enthusiasm. Competing releases reflecting contemporary sensibilities captured cultural attention. And the traditional musical form no longer generated automatic repeat viewings. The returns did not collapse outright. They simply failed to justify the investment. Losses were substantial once distribution splits, marketing costs, and interest were calculated. For a studio already recalibrating after earlier financial shocks, this underperformance reinforced an emerging conclusion. The Golden Age production formula was no longer reliable. Internally, executives began reassessing large-scale musical greenlights. Budget controls tightened. Risk modeling adjusted toward smaller, more contemporary projects. The era of lavish, nostalgia-driven spectacles began to recede. Hello, Dolly did not trigger bankruptcy proceedings. It did not force emergency asset sales on the scale of Cleopatra. Its impact was more gradual, but equally instructive. It confirmed that timing matters as much as scale. A production designed to evoke theatrical elegance arrived during a generational transition. Audience loyalty had migrated. Cultural appetite had evolved. The old certainty that star power and ornate production design guaranteed profitability had eroded. The Golden Age studio system was built on control, controlled talent contracts, controlled exhibition pipelines, controlled brand identity. By 1969, control was fragmenting. Hello, Dolly stands as a marker of that transition. Not a collapse, not a scandal, but a financial signal that the architecture of classic Hollywood spectacle could no longer operate without adaptation. The palaces were still standing, but the crowds were no longer guaranteed. This wasn't just a film, and it was a personal wager. John Wayne had wanted to make the Alamo for over a decade. When major studios hesitated at the scale and cost, Wayne moved forward independently through his company, Batjack Productions. He mortgaged personal assets. He deferred salary. He assumed risk that larger corporations had refused to absorb. The production ballooned quickly. A full-scale replica of the Alamo mission was constructed in Texas. Thousands of extras were hired. The shooting schedule extended. Weather conditions added delays. The final budget reached approximately $12 million, a massive exposure for an independent company in 1960. Wayne believed patriotic spectacle would guarantee attendance. Initial box office numbers were strong but not extraordinary. The film performed solidly, yet not at the level required to recover costs quickly. That distribution splits reduced studio retention. International returns were weaker than hoped. Award recognition did not translate into sustained financial lift. Debt lingered. Batjack faced serious liquidity pressure. Wayne personally carried financial strain for years following release. Loans were refinanced. Future projects were carefully scaled. The company survived, but not without consequence. The Alamo did not destroy Batjack outright, but it demonstrated how even a respected star producer could miscalculate the cost-to-return ratio of epic ambition. In the golden age, major studios could sometimes absorb these blows. Independent producers rarely could. Wayne completed his dream project. The financial aftershocks lasted much longer than the applause. United Artists built its reputation on artistic prestige. By the mid-1960s, it sought to deliver a monumental biblical epic to compete with earlier religious blockbusters. The result was The Greatest Story Ever Told. Directed by George Stevens and featuring an expansive cast, the production aimed for solemn grandeur. Filming spanned years. Locations stretched across the American Southwest. The budget escalated beyond $20 million. The pacing was deliberate. The runtime extended well beyond 3 hours. The tone was reverent and restrained. Audiences, however, were shifting. Spectacle alone was no longer sufficient. The film opened to mixed reactions. Some admired its scale. Others found it distant. Repeat viewings were limited. Financially, the returns disappointed sharply relative to cost. United Artists had structured financing across multiple projects. A loss of this magnitude tightened internal budgets and altered risk assessment across the slate. While the studio did not formally collapse in 1965, it entered a period of vulnerability that would define its cautious approach for years. Epic biblical filmmaking had peaked earlier in the decade. By the time this production arrived, the appetite had cooled. The film remains visually ambitious, but in corporate accounting terms, it was a warning. Large-scale reverence does not guarantee box office endurance. For United Artists, prestige carried a price. The numbers were optimistic. The timing was not. Paint Your Wagon was conceived as a hybrid, part Western, part musical, designed to combine rugged frontier themes with Broadway spectacle. Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin were cast in unconventional singing roles, banking on star recognition to offset genre risk. Production was difficult from the start. Mountain locations created logistical delays, weather disrupted schedules, musical arrangements required extensive post-production adjustments. The budget climbed past $20 million. By 1969, audience taste had shifted dramatically. Youth-driven cinema was ascendant. Countercultural narratives were reshaping expectations. A traditional large-scale musical western felt out of sync with the moment. The film's box office was moderate, but not nearly strong enough to justify investment. Paramount absorbed substantial losses. Some corporate restructuring soon followed. Paramount's parent company, Gulf Plus Western, began exerting stronger oversight. Production strategies shifted towards smaller, risk-controlled projects. Executive leadership reevaluated greenlight criteria. The Golden Age model, prestige musicals, massive sets, controlled star vehicles, was eroding. Paint Your Wagon did not close Paramount's doors, but it contributed to a broader recalibration of the studio system. When spectacle misreads cultural timing, financial impact extends beyond a single release. It reshapes policy. And by 1969, policy across Hollywood was changing. The war had just ended. Audiences were returning to theaters in record numbers. Hollywood appeared stable again, confident, profitable, dominant. And then came excess. Producer David O. Selznick had already proven his appetite for scale with Gone with the Wind. With Duel in the Sun, he attempted to repeat spectacle, but bigger, louder, and more provocative. The film was marketed as an event, a super western, a prestige melodrama with sweeping landscapes, heightened emotion, and major stars. Production did not proceed cleanly. Multiple directors were involved over time. Scenes were rewritten and reshot. Selznick personally supervised edits with relentless detail. Filming extended beyond original schedules. Labor costs expanded. Marketing expenditures ballooned before release. The final budget surged to approximately $8 million, an extraordinary figure for 1946, especially for an independent production company. Selznick financed aggressively, leveraging distribution deals and anticipated box office strength. The assumption was simple: scale guarantees return. Upon release, Duel in the Sun performed well in some markets, but failed to generate the sustained dominance required to justify its cost. Critical response was divided. Some praised the visual ambition. Others found the tone excessive. Attendance declined after the initial surge. Revenue did not collapse, but neither did it compensate for the production gamble. For Selznick International Pictures, the financial exposure was significant. Cash reserves tightened. Debt obligations remained. Future production plans were scaled back. The studio, once positioned as a prestige powerhouse, operating alongside the major vertically integrated companies, entered a visible contraction. By the late 1940s, Selznick dissolved much of his independent production structure. Asset control shifted. The company no longer functioned as a consistent large-scale production entity. It would be inaccurate to claim that Duel in the Sun single-handedly destroyed Selznick International, but it marked a turning point. It demonstrated the fragility of independent spectacle during the Golden Age. Without the protective infrastructure of theater ownership and diversified output, one oversized production could destabilize an entire operation. The major studios had buffers. Independents did not. Duel in the Sun remains visually bold. Its landscapes endure. Its ambition is undeniable. But financially, it exposed the limits of prestige without proportional control. The Golden Age rewarded confidence. It punished overextension. And for Selznick's empire, the sun did not rise as brightly after it set. By the mid-1950s, RKO was already unstable. Ownership changes, executive turmoil, production slowdowns. The once major studio had endured years of disruption following acquisition by Howard Hughes. Release schedules were inconsistent. Financing structures were erratic. The Conqueror was conceived as an epic historical drama starring John Wayne. Filming took place in remote desert locations. Costs escalated. Critical reception upon release was muted, and audience response was weak. Financially, the returns did little to stabilize RKO's declining position. The film's underperformance added strain to a studio already suffering from structural fragility. In 1957, RKO ceased regular production. Assets were liquidated. Just the once powerful company effectively dissolved as a major Hollywood force. It would be inaccurate to claim the Conqueror single-handedly destroyed RKO, but it symbolized the culmination of mismanagement, risky investments, and declining audience share. It was one of the final large-scale gambles made by a studio already nearing collapse. The Golden Age had produced giants. RKO became one of the first to fall permanently.
The river looked calm. The balance sheet wasn't. The Sand Pebbles, starring Steve McQueen, was mounted as a prestige epic, politically serious, visually expansive, internationally staged. Filming took place across Hong Kong and Taiwan, requiring naval coordination, complex logistics, and extended location schedules. Costs escalated past $12 million. For most studios in peak condition, that was manageable. Fox was not in peak condition. This came only a few years after the Cleopatra crisis. Liquidity was still tight. Backlot acreage had already been sold. Executive leadership was cautious but still willing to gamble on scale. The film opened to respectable box office numbers and strong critical recognition. It received multiple Academy Award nominations. But respectable was not enough. International receipts underperformed expectations. Long-running time-limited daily screenings. Our roadshow-style positioning increased marketing expenditure. Once distribution splits were factored in, profit margins narrowed sharply. Fox did not collapse, but the film reinforced a growing reality. Large-scale prestige productions no longer guaranteed reliable return. The studio further reduced epic exposure afterward. The Golden Age model, bigger equals safer, was eroding in real time. This one didn't collapse loudly. It drained quietly. When Warner Brothers entered the early 1960s, already navigating post-antitrust restructuring and declining theater attendance, the studio needed contemporary relevance. The Chapman Report was marketed as daring adult drama, topical, controversial, prestige-driven. Production costs were elevated relative to projected audience size. Marketing emphasized its boldness. The expectation was strong urban turnout. The turnout didn't sustain. The film underperformed commercially. It failed to connect with mainstream audiences and lacked the prestige cushion of awards recognition. For Warner Brothers, already in cost control mode, the disappointment compounded ongoing financial tightening. By the mid-1960s, Warner underwent structural shifts, scaling production volume and leaning into lower-risk genre programming. Corporate leadership changes followed. Long-term strategy moved away from prestige adult dramas toward more controlled budget projects. And the Chapman Report was not catastrophic in isolation, but it exemplified the vulnerability of mid-scale prestige productions in a shrinking golden age marketplace. Not every destabilization arrives with headlines. Some arrive as confirmation that the system no longer works.
The gamble was technological. Fox Film Corporation invested heavily in an early widescreen format known as grandeur. The objective was to leap ahead of competitors with a new cinematic experience. John Wayne was introduced as a leading man in a sweeping frontier epic designed to showcase expansive landscapes. The production scale was impressive. The financial timing was catastrophic. In 1930, the United States was entering the Great Depression. Theaters were struggling. Converting projection systems to widescreen required capital most exhibitors did not have. As a result, the majority of venues screened a standard format version, eliminating the technological advantage that justified the film's expense. The box office response was underwhelming. Fox was already exposed to broader market instability following the 1929 stock market crash. The failure of the Big Trail tightened liquidity further. Debt obligations mounted. By 1933, Fox Film Corporation entered receivership. The company survived only through merger. In 1935, it combined with 20th Century Pictures, forming what became 20th Century Fox. The film did not act alone. Economic collapse was the larger force, but its miscalculated innovation deepened vulnerability at a critical moment. A bold attempt to define the future instead forced corporate surrender. It began as a prestige historical drama. It became the most expensive film ever produced at the time. Originally budgeted near $2 million, Cleopatra expanded beyond $40 million due to production shutdowns, illness, set reconstruction, and director changes. Filming moved from London to Rome. Elaborate sets were rebuilt from scratch. Public scrutiny surrounding the off-screen relationship between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton intensified media attention, but did not reduce costs. Cash flow deteriorated rapidly during production. 20th Century Fox required emergency financing to maintain operations. Corporate leadership shifted mid-crisis. Internal memoranda from the period reveal concerns about solvency if revenues failed to stabilize quickly. When the film finally released, it became the highest-grossing film of 1963. That headline concealed the problem. Theaters retained a large percentage of ticket sales. Marketing expenditures were extensive. Interest on borrowed capital accumulated. Profit recovery was slow, not immediate. To survive, Fox sold approximately 300 acres of its Los Angeles backlot, property later developed into Century City. Production output was reduced. Executive authority was restructured. Financial oversight tightened permanently. Fox avoided formal bankruptcy, but it stood closer to insolvency than any major studio of the Golden Age. An epic about imperial collapse nearly mirrored corporate reality. On screen, Rome fell dramatically. Behind the scenes, a studio nearly did. Hollywood's golden age wasn't ended by scandal. It was ended by math. Studios that once controlled theaters, stars, and entire city blocks nearly collapsed because a single film misjudged scale, timing, or audience appetite. These weren't just flops. They were financial fault lines. And here's the unsettling truth. Every era believes it's too powerful to fall. The next empire rarely sees the numbers coming, and history has a habit of repeating the same mistake.